Well, we are going to conclude this series called the Inversion Principle, and where we've been talking about the upside down teachings of Jesus. So if it's your first time, you kind of come in at the end of the movie, but it's okay, you can catch up. This past week, I had a surprise visit from a guy that I went to high school with that I haven't seen since graduation day. And it's over 40 years. I'm sorry, I had to say that, but it's been over 40 years since I saw this guy. I graduated, went to college. He graduated, went to the Navy. I saw the classroom. He saw the world. I don't know who got the better deal there. But anyway, he contacted me this week. We caught up on Facebook in the last few years, but I haven't seen him. And so he happened to be in town. He said, "Can I stop by?" I said, "Sure, man." His name is Jeff, and he stopped by, and we kind of, he had to catch up on 40 years, and a lot to talk about. But basically, what he came to see me about was this. He said, "Bobby, by the time it was over with," and he'd been through a lot. He had been through a divorce. He'd been through a car crash. I mean, so many things in his life he caught me up on. But by the time it was all over, he said this: "Bobby, I needed to see you. I wanted you to know that when we were in high school, you had a powerful influence on me coming to Christ." Now, that'll make you feel good, won't it? And it also is a warning that you don't know who's watching you. So you better make sure that you're pointing toward Christ. That made me feel good. But what was interesting to me is as he was telling me what was going on, he used these words: broken, humbled, emptied, and dying. Does that sound familiar? It's what we've been talking about these last few weeks. And through his testimony, he told me I had to be broken. And so he was broken, and God made him whole. He was humbled, and God exalted him. He had to empty himself so that Christ could fill him. And then he had to die to himself, as we talked about last week, so that Christ could live through him. And I thought, for me, it was just a confirmation of what we've been talking about the last 4 weeks, that sometimes God has to do something to us in order to do something through us. And I really hope and pray that that's exactly what's happened as we've talked about this, because many of us are broken and need to be whole. And some of us need to be humbled so that God can exalt us. And many of us need to empty ourselves of the things of the world so that Christ can fill us. And that we have to die to our own desires so that we can live for Christ. And today, we're going to talk about something that's probably the hardest one of all. And the reason it's the hardest one of all is because it hits us right in the pocketbook. And if it's your first time here today, you may think, is that all this church talks about, is giving? No, you just came on the one Sunday when that's what we talk about. So don't think we talk about that all the time, because we don't. But because of the time of the year that it is, and just simply because this is one of the important upside-down teachings of Jesus, I felt it important that we talk about this, because we got a lot of things going on with our Hope Christmas offering and things like that. I just want to remind you of that, and I wanted to use today to really get ingrained to us a very important principle that Jesus taught. Now, how many of you have been and visited Fredericksburg, Texas? Anybody here been to Fredericksburg? Quite a few of you, yes. Okay, it's a beautiful place to go, isn't it? And especially at this time of the year, they got all kinds of good stuff going on with the holidays. And I love to ride my motorcycle through those hills, and it's just a beautiful place to visit. But there's a little bit more meaning to it, perhaps for me than for many of you. If you go to Fredericksburg, you may want to do this next time you're there. Go by the Hill Country Memorial Hospital. That's the big hospital there. And if you go by there, you're going to see this building. Got a picture of it here. This is the intensive care unit at Hill Country Memorial Hospital. And you can't read the name on it, so I put the name to the side. It's the Don and Julie Holden Intensive Care Unit. Okay? Now, that means nothing to you, I'm sure. But what that means to me is my great uncle and aunt are Don and Julie Holden. And so this entire wing of the hospital was donated by him. He was very, very wealthy, okay? Somehow it didn't trickle down to me, but he was very, very wealthy. And so I did not get to know him that much because he just wasn't around us that much. Don had no family on his side. He was an only child, and he and my great aunt had no children. And so because they had a lot of money, they traveled the world, they did all kinds of things. And when he retired in Fredericksburg. Now, I Googled it just to see if I could find it, because you can find anything on Google, right? But I Googled him, and I found his obituary. He died in 2003, and I just wanted to, so that you can kind of get to know him a little bit, just a really short paragraph about him and who he was. It says this: Mr. Donald L. Don Holden of Fredericksburg, Texas, formerly of Corpus Christi, Texas, passed away in a Fredericksburg hospital on May 16, 2003, at the age of 94 years. So he lived a long time. He was a former resident of Corpus Christi, Texas, the former owner of Gulf Coast Chevrolet Company, and that's where he made a lot of his money, that and some investments that he had done, and his ship came in. He retired and moved to his ranch in Fredericksburg. He was a member of the Lions Club, the Corpus Christi Town Club, the Hill Country Memorial Hospital Foundation, and the Hill Country Memorial Hospital Board. Mr. Holden is survived by numerous nieces and nephews, and one of those would be my mother. Funeral services will be held on Monday, May 19th, 2003 at 2 p.m. in the Chapel of Shatter Funeral Home in Fredericksburg, interment in Greenwood Cemetery in Fredericksburg. And then the last line says, those who so desire may make memorial contributions in his memory to the Hill Country Memorial Hospital Foundation Fund or to the charity of their choice. Now, as I said, I can only recall seeing my great-uncle a few times, around the holidays usually, when I saw him. But to my knowledge, and from what my grandmother told me, and from what my mother told me, my Uncle Don had no relationship with God, none whatsoever. And he might occasionally attend a Christmas service every so often, but for the most part, he felt like he didn't need God. He had all that he needed, and it was in the bank. But the thing about it is, when he was about 5 years before he died, he did something interesting. And he invited my grandmother and her two brothers, my two other great uncles on her side, and my mother and all of her siblings, my uncles and aunts on that side, to a dinner at a hotel there somewhere in Fredericksburg. And when I asked Mom, when she was telling me about this, I said, well, why do you think he wants to do this? And she felt like, well, he's getting older now. He was in the late 80s, so he maybe he's going to give some away. Because up to that point, he had done nothing with it except to give to charitable organizations like the hospital. Well, they had this thing, and they didn't invite, it didn't trickle down to us grandkids and all that stuff. It stopped right there at my mother's side and her siblings. And sure enough, my Uncle Don passed out checks. For my grandmother and her two brothers, he wrote a check to each of them for $20,000 apiece. And then it came to my mother and her siblings, and then her cousins as well. Each of them got a check for $10,000 apiece. By the time the night was over, my uncle had given away over $200,000. Now that sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? For most of us, $200,000 is a lot of money. But to him, it was nothing. He was worth millions. And whereas, we look at that and go, well, that was very generous, and it was a very generous, gift. But what I know from him and what my parents have told me and my grandmother, it was more a stave off the vultures gift than it was anything else. It was a way for him to keep the family away from his true wealth. Because what he really wanted to do with that wealth was keep his name alive. Thus you have the Don and Julie Holden Intensive Care Unit. The only problem with that building is one day what's going to happen? That building will not be there eventually, and neither will his name. So what that means for my uncle, because he had no relationship with God, was that everything he did here stays here. And he didn't understand this principle that I want to introduce to you today that Jesus introduced 2,000 years ago. It's upside down, but it's this. Giving away in this life results in receiving more in the life to come. Giving away now while I'm alive will result in more when I'm in eternity. Now, the reason that's so upside down is because you and I have, at least in my generation, have grown up with a lot of pastors and speakers talking about what I call the prosperity gospel. And the prosperity gospel says, if you give it away here, you'll get it here. Now, there may be some truth to that, but I don't think that works in every case. And I'll take my parents, for instance. By the time they passed away, they were giving away over half of their income. Simply, they had just increased it every year until the point where they were giving away over half of their income back to eternal purposes. They were not wealthy. That $10,000 my mother got was gone in a week. They weren't wealthy. However, they were never in need. All of their needs were met. So that prosperity gospel that sometimes you hear is not necessarily true. Yes, God will make sure that your needs are met, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be wealthy just because you give it away here. But Jesus says if you do give it away here, I can guarantee you're going to get more there. That's the concept. So I want us to read from this parable that Jesus told. And if you look at it, it's got my Uncle Don all over it. And so you'll kind of meet him in this parable as well. And as we go through this, there's a question that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. It's a very interesting question, one I don't think we think of so much because of where we are in our culture. But here's the question. Why do I have more than I really need? Why do I have more than I really need? Now, some of you are going, well, wait, Bobby, you don't understand. I'm feeling pressure right now. I don't feel like I have more than I need. I don't think I have enough. If I could just take you on a trip with me to Haiti, you would realize that you have more than you need. Because some of them face the very basic needs that they don't have. And here in America, because we're such, a culture that is consumer, we don't think we have more than we need. To which I would say, well, I know you have to have such and such, this much amount to make your house payment. I understand that. But my question would be, okay, do you really need that much house? Do you really need that expensive of a car? And see, we don't ask that question because it's more than we need. Now, there's nothing wrong with having any of that stuff. Nothing wrong with being wealthy. Nothing wrong with having stuff. But when we have more than we need, we assume that it's for us. And the reason we feel so uncomfortable is, here's the reason, is because here's our income and here's our lifestyle. And our lifestyle just keeps bumping into our income. And when we get a bonus or we get a raise and we go, what? Here's the income goes up. What do we do with it? Boom. The lifestyle goes up. And for many people, it does this. And you start getting into debt. And then it really starts to get pressure. I want to help you understand a concept today. That it may not help you get out of debt. It could get you on the road to getting out of debt. But it will at least assure you that what you do here has meaning in eternity. And an investment here reaps benefits there. Okay? So we're going to look at this parable and see if we can't answer this question. Why do I have more than I really need? Luke chapter 12 is where we're going to be. And Jesus is teaching, and while he's teaching, and I don't know why this person brought this up, but someone interrupts him with a question. And Jesus, as always, will take the spur of the moment stuff, use it for a teaching moment. So in verse 13, someone called out from the crowd, "Teacher, please tell my brother to divide our father's estate with me." So evidently this guy's father has died and he's not getting his fair share. So he's asking Jesus, "Hey, tell my brother to share my father's estate with me." And here's what Jesus said, "Friend, who made me judge over you to decide such things as that?" In other words, it's none of my business. I don't even know why you're asking this. But in verse 15, he says this, "Beware, guard against every kind of greed." Now, wait a minute, Jesus. Did you just change the subject? What has this got to do with greed? And here's a guy who's not getting his fair share. And now you're talking about greed? And in this parable, Jesus is going to define greed for us. And let me tell you why this is important. Because it is very difficult for you and for me to see greed in the mirror. Very difficult. We can see it in other people, but we have a hard time seeing it in ourselves. See, I can see anger in the mirror. I can see guilt in the mirror. I can see all kinds of things in the mirror, except I have really struggled with seeing greed in the mirror. Because if I talk to someone and we call them greedy, they would definitely argue, "I'm not greedy. I'm just very careful with my money and with my stuff." It's hard for us to see greed in the mirror. But Jesus says, look, it's a subtle thing, and you need to watch out for every kind of greed. Now look at what he says in the middle of verse 15, because this is huge. In fact, I want you to read this next line with me. It starts with life. Okay, ready? "Life is not measured by how much you own." Now say that again. Life is not measured by how much you own. See, I think that's worth remembering. So I want us to write it down, but I want us to write it down this way. My life does not equal what I own. My life does not equal what I own. Now, I know that intellectually. We know that intellectually. But it's very easy to slip into this mindset where we feel like our life is measured by the stuff we have. And many times it has to do, with our self-worth, that our self-value is dependent on how much we own and whether we're keeping up with the Joneses. So, life is not measured, Jesus says, by what you own. And having laid this concept on them, he goes into this parable, and this is where we meet my uncle. Verse 16. Then he told them a story. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. Now, what kind of man was he? A rich man. Yes, a rich man. What is a rich man? A rich man is someone who has more than they need. A rich man has abundance. A rich man is somebody who has extra. In fact, this guy was already rich, and he had a better than expected crop, as we'll see. So he had enough room in his barns to store up an average crop, but he had a problem on his hands. He had extra. So what's he going to do with it? Verse 17. He said to himself, and we're going to see that he talks to himself a whole lot in this parable. He said to himself, "What should I do? I don't have room for all my crops." What a dilemma. I mean, doesn't your heart go out to him? I don't have room. I've got all this extra, and I don't have enough room to store all of my extra. Now, I'm sure that the people that were in Jesus' audience that day were thinking the same thing you're thinking. Well, I can tell you something to do with it. I got places you can put it. But, see, that's why it's so hard to see greed in the mirror. We can see greed in his mirror, but we don't see it in ours. You see, he assumed about his possessions what I assume about mine and what you assume about yours. When I have extra, it's for me. It's for me. When you have extra, It's for you. See, the lifestyle is chasing the income, and when I have extra, then I just raise it up. I notch it up a little bit because I think it's for me. When I get a raise, here I go. When I get a bonus, here I go. It's for me. Now you need a bigger garage. Now you got to rent a storage unit. You know all that stuff. So this guy has no place to put his extra, and he comes up with a brilliant plan. Look at verse 18. Then he said, I know. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all my wheat and other goods. Now, that's a great plan, right? I mean, this guy ought to write a book on how to deal with extra. I'll tear down what I got. I'll build bigger ones. I'll rent the storage units. I'll do what I have to do. Verse 19, he says, then I'll have room enough to store all my wheat and other goods. And I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now, take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, here's what he did, a smart thing. He planned for the future. But what we'll discover is he just didn't plan far enough out. And he planned to take care of himself. He just didn't plan to take care of himself far enough out. See, there was a fatal flaw in his thinking. His fatal flaw was, since I have a number of years of stuff, then I must have a number of years to spend that stuff on me. Evidently, my life is measured by what I own. So here's something that you need to write down. Extra money does not guarantee extra time. Extra money does not guarantee extra time. And again, we know this intellectually, but for some reason it just doesn't sink in. This guy's problem was not that he was rich. There is nothing wrong with being rich. The problem this guy had was he didn't know why he was rich. He didn't know why he had extra. See, if we asked him that question that I asked you at the beginning, why do I have more than I really need? His answer would have been, well, I guess it's for me to store up for myself for years to come. For me, me, me. But look at what Jesus says in verse 20. But God said to him, you fool. Wait. Fool? I mean, isn't he the model? He's not a fool. Isn't he the American dream? No, he's a fool. And here's what God says. You will die this very night. And here's a question I want you to answer. Okay? Then who will get everything you worked for? Who will get everything you worked for? Do you know the answer to that? 2 words. Anybody? Somebody else. Somebody else. One day you and I are going to die just like this guy. And what's going to happen to all your stuff? Who's going to get it? Somebody else. Somebody else. It's going to get everything you own, not because you were generous, but because you were dead. Somebody else is going to get everything you stored up, but not because you thought of them, not because you made a decision, not because you were unselfish, but simply because you died. And Mr. Rich Man, or Uncle Don as I call him, you made 2 wrong assumptions. You assumed that you were the source of your income, and you assumed, too, that the extra was for you. Now look at verse 21. Jesus says, yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth but not have a rich relationship with God. And there's the upside down principle. In other words, this is what happens to anyone who stores up things for themselves but are not rich toward God. Now, what does it mean to have a rich relationship with God? Well, just a few verses down, Jesus explains it in verse 33. Here's what he says. sell your possessions, and give to those in need. This will store up treasure for you in heaven. And the purses of heaven never get old or develop holes. Your treasure will be safe. No thief can steal it, and no moth can destroy it. And Jesus lays down this principle and says, look, if you're really serious about this question of why do I have more than I really need, here's the answer. When I have more than I need, I should give it to someone who is in need. So you might want to write that down. When I have more than I need, I should give to those that are in need. And Jesus defines that for us. Later on in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul models that for us because he takes the money that was given and he puts it into eternal things, into things all around the world that have to do with eternity. To have a rich relationship with God is to take what we don't need because we have extra and to put it in the hands of someone who is in need. See, that's why we do the Hope for the Holidays Christmas offering every year. Is we look around and we see those who are in need and people that we partner with year-round actually to meet the needs of the orphans in Haiti, of the orphanage that's at South Texas Children's Home. When we talk about helping the teachers at the Therapeutical Education Program at Klein Oak High School or Klein School District, teachers that don't get anything done for them all year except for this, to say thank you for what you do, because they have a very difficult job in that particular program. And then the families that come to us during the holidays that have needs for their families and people without jobs and have children and can't have Christmas for their kids. This is why we do this. It's so that we can take what we don't need and give it to those who are in need, and thereby investing it in eternity, because eventually, we hope and pray that those people in our giving will see Christ in that. And many times they do. A couple of weeks ago, I had someone at the end of one of the services come in and put a check in my pocket for $100. And some people do that and say, hey, would you put this in the offering? And I'm glad to do that for you. But this was made out to me. And I said, okay, well, thank you. And I've learned that when someone does that to me, when someone gives me a little extra, that something is about to happen that I'm going to have to use it on. I've just learned that. And so, okay, I just held it. I didn't cash it. I just held it to see what I was going to need that I didn't know I was going to need. And sure enough, you remember that first Arctic front that came through a couple weeks ago? I went out to my truck and it would not start. I finally jumped it off and I drove it to Walmart. I said, can you check my battery? They checked it, and guess what? Yep, I had to have a new battery. Guess what it cost? $100. So here was a person who didn't know that was going to be my need, but she had a little extra, and she gave it to me, maybe because she knew that I would, if I didn't need it, I would put it to somebody who I thought would need it. But as it turned out, I needed it. I needed it. That's what Christ followers do when they have extra, is they take what they don't need and they give it to those who are in need, because they understand this principle that giving away in this lifetime results in getting more on the other side. Because God is so interested in eternal things, not the temporal stuff that doesn't last. And see, my uncle didn't understand that principle. He thought by putting his name on a building that his name would live forever. And it's going to live for a while, but not forever. And what a shame, because it was a total loss. Not only did he was not able to take it with him, he had to leave it to somebody else. But there's nothing on the other side waiting for him. So, that's why you hear us say this from time to time. And some of you have been through the financial peace classes with Dave Ramsey and learned this principle. And it's very simple. Give, save, live on the rest. Give, save, live on the rest. Can you say that with me? Give, save, live on the rest. It's very biblical in that God tells us to honor him with our first fruits. We give first, then we take care of ourselves. See, that's upside down. We think it's for us. God says, no, it's for me. I'll take care of you if you'll help me take care of others. So we give, save, live on the rest. One of the ways that he does that in the Bible and through both the Old and New Testaments was something called percentage giving. He called it a tithe. A tithe just means 10%. But the thing about percentage giving is it doesn't matter what the percentage is. What it basically does is it teaches us not to be greedy. If I sit down and say, you know what, I'm going to give 10% of all my income to those that are in need, or I'm going to give 5%, or I'm going to give 25%, or as my parents did, over 50%, I'm going to give it away to those in need. And we do that first, and then we adjust the lifestyle. Can you imagine the impact if we all did that? If all of our finances were geared around giving instead of getting, and on around others instead of ourselves? Wow, what God could do to meet needs in our community and around the world. And I'm just telling you, what you do here matters on the other side. Because when you give to the Hope for the Holidays offering, for instance, you may not ever know this in this life, but on the other life, there may be an orphan that comes up to you and says, thank you so much for giving so that I could eat, so that I could get an education. Or someone that you didn't even know that lives close to you in this community comes up and says, thank you for helping my family get Christmas. It changed my life, and I began to follow Christ. Oh, eternity matters, folks. So why do I have more than I really need? Because there's a need that God wants me to meet. And I want you to keep that in mind, because God is interested in eternal things, not temporal things. And I pray that that's our perspective, not only at this time of the year when it's so important, but every single day of the year, to keep in mind, why do I have what I have? Is there something God wants me to do with it to change someone's life?